Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Sino-American relations continue to deteriorate despite both realizing they need each other more than ever. In that context, China and the U.S. are trying to achieve a working dialogue that would be mutually beneficial. Unfortunately, it seems any progress is trumped by another escalating point of conflict. The simple reality is both are moving forward on different paths, which only accelerates the divergences. I want to talk about those paths in this session and how they are at odds with each other. In attempts to stabilize the situation after prior visits or meetings by Secretary of Commerce Gino Raimondo, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, along with U.S. Senate and Congressional Committee members, it came down to Janet Yellen arriving in Beijing for a no-holds-barred session. The diverging paths forward and the purpose of Yellen's trip is the focus of this visit. As such, I want to discuss the areas outlined here. The billing for Yellen's trip was purely optics and doomed to failure in that regard before she even left. The rush trip by Janet Yellen to meet with her Chinese counterparts was billed to improve Sino-American relations. Festering, unresolved issues have been steadily deteriorating on multiple fronts, but her trip was touted to be focused on trade relations. We disagree, and I'll talk more about what the trip was really all about. The Chinese have been pointedly clear that the U.S. is the problem, and there is little reason for wasted talks on the subject. A meeting seeking China to change its trade policies, in their opinion, was simply not going to result in that occurring. The U.S. political optics, therefore, was to demonstrate to the U.S. electorate that the Biden administration was doing everything it could to achieve a working trade relationship with China before the inevitable collision resulted in much broadening tariffs on Chinese consumer goods, not just the current tariffs on industrial and technology products and components. The obvious goal was public preparation for tariffs and the directly resulting rising U.S. goods inflation. Part of the second wave of inflation we've been warning about throughout Q1 that Yellen's direction of deglobalization and de-risking will inevitably lead to. It will be a contributor in addition to already in the inflation pipeline items such as service inflation, energy, food, and unaffordable shelter. Tariffs and heightened possibilities of escalating Chinese trade wars are now a real possibility. The result will be rising consumer good prices in the U.S. since China is a dominant supplier of almost everything in the average American home or apartment. This will all be part of Wave 2 of U.S. inflation, something that the U.S. consumer must be prepared for, or at least for the government to have demonstrated it did everything possible before bringing the hammer fully down on tariffs, after the election, of course, is over. Eventually, a failed U.S. industrial policy will hide behind the accusations of currency manipulation. Continued inflation in the U.S., especially as it impacts the consumer, is a major problem in a 70% based economy. There is a strong likelihood that the U.S. dollar will deteriorate as trade deficits increase, compounding the problem. Expect China to be accused of currency manipulation when the battle finally heats up. The concealed reason for the trip is to attempt to reestablish China as a buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds, or minimally to stop the unwinding of its Treasury holdings and reduce de-dollarization efforts by the ever-expanding BRIC 10 trading bloc. That was going to be a tough sell, even for a political operative and manipulator of the proven stature of a Janet Yellen. China's selling of its holdings of U.S. Treasury debt is a major problem for Yellen and the U.S. For the 9th month of the last 11, Chinese Treasury holdings declined in February. That's the latest TIC data, dropping by $22.7 billion. Additionally, it has now been 24 of the last 28 months that China's Treasury holdings have declined, now back at practically its lowest level since June of 2009. As of January 2024, China owned $798 billion in U.S. Treasuries, which is roughly 10% of the U.S. national debt. This is the lowest, however, share of outstanding treasuries in 22 years, and down from a record 14% in 2011 when it was $1.3 trillion, and only marginally smaller than Japan as the largest holder of U.S. debt. As this chart illustrates, the problem is only getting worse and at a faster rate. China's ongoing dumping of Treasury holdings couldn't come at a worse time, with the U.S. Treasury needing to finance unprecedented spending deficits. The U.S. deficit estimates only mid-year into the current fiscal year are presently estimated to be between 1.5 and 2.1 trillion, approaching 8% of GDP. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen needs buyers of this debt and the vast amount of the existing $34 trillion coming due and needing to be rolled over. While we are acutely aware of the fact that correlation is not causation, one would find it hard to argue that the practically perfect overlay of China's Treasury holdings and the yield of the U.S. 10-year Treasury note over the past 3 years, it makes us wonder if, away from the QT, the Fed speak, the macroeconomy, the geopolitical crisis, the AI hype, the growth scares, it's just not all well managed. Though slow and steady, a liquidation of China's still massive U.S. Treasury holdings. It's hard to argue that China doesn't have an incentive to de-dollarize or not liquidate at all, which would shoot themselves in the foot. While de-dollarizing has been steady in Treasury land, enabled by a vast sea of liquid other players, things have been a little more obvious in the alternative currency space like gold. The 2015 jump in the chart shown here was when China suddenly admitted to its gold holdings, well, some of them we assume, after no disclosure since 2009. Since then, both China and Russia, shown by the gold line at the bottom, have been hoarding the precious metal while dumping treasuries. This illustration consists of two panes, an upper and a lower. It may be a little difficult to see. The upper pane compares the inverse of U.S. Treasury yields to Chinese Treasury holdings, while the lower overlays the combined gold buying of China and Russia. What is happening is, 1, there is an almost perfect correlation in the top pane of China selling its U.S. Treasury holdings with falling prices of those U.S. Treasuries from selling pressures. As you are aware, as prices for Treasuries fall, the yield goes up. 2, China's selling is having a clear impact on rising U.S. Treasuries, as there is not another major player to both pick up the selling from China but also to absorb the massive increase in the U.S. deficit from historic levels of spending. 3, the lower pane shows a strong correlation with where that money is going. It is helping to pay for the major gold accumulation underway in China and Russia, and not included here also by the BRIC-10 alliance led by China. The vertical red line in January 2021 shows the change of the U.S. presidential leadership and a new administrative regime. It clearly shows that something then contributed in some way to this shift, or at least the acceleration of it. Again, as the top pane's vertical red line indicates, the impact of China's selling of U.S. Treasuries has accelerated since Janet Yellen and the Biden administration assumed power. Yellen was quite quick in immediately reacting to the problem. Yellen quickly began using the Treasury General Account, or the TGA, along with other methods to control the damage and additionally allow the funding of massive new fiscal deficits. I have previously laid out in my newsletters as matters unfolded how Yellen did this through 2 stages of stealth liquidity and Treasury funding as summarized here. After the Biden administration masterfully orchestrated the suspension of the debt ceiling till after the presidential election, Yellen was set free to tackle the problem. The Bank Term Funding Program, or BTFP, which had been implemented 3 months earlier, allowed this shift in massive reserves held at the Federal Reserve in reverse repos. Stage 1 was centered on using the $2.7 trillion reverse repo holdings at the Fed to flow through the U.S. Treasury, primarily in the offering of short-term T-bill Treasury funding, at least initially. The repo asset drawdown was taken down to $350 billion today for a liquidity insertion of $2.4 trillion. As Stage 1 was run down, Yellen and the Fed then triggered Stage 2, which allowed the major banks to arb nearly $52 billion from the BTFP trading to expand its lending facilities in dramatic fashion. In turn, this expanded $52 trillion was used to effectively create unlimited money to buy U.S. treasuries when it was moved through high-leverage hedge funds in the form of leveraged loans for them to buy longer-dated U.S. treasury notes and bonds. This all worked exceedingly well until recently. Suddenly, the auctions hit a brick wall and auction tails were at unprecedented levels. There was basically a buyer strike by the leveraged hedge funds expected to buy the treasury offerings. Yellen's trip required her to ideally get China to buy U.S. debt with its currency reserves, but minimally she needed to convince China to stop selling U.S. Treasury holdings, at least temporarily. It was causing major concerns with the highly leveraged hedge funds that they would be left holding the bags, therefore a buyer strike. If she couldn't do that, she needed to convince China in her negotiations to assist in slowing the rapidly expanding and powerful BRICS 10 trading consortium and reducing its de-dollarization strategies, at least in the near term. She needed to convince everyone it is in their best interest. Yellen was also acutely aware that when the Fed does finally pivot and starts reducing rates, it will place downward pressure on the dollar, making U.S. imported goods even more expensive by basically importing inflation. She needed an agreement with China that they would maintain their international currency against the U.S. and react constructively when the U.S. began placing fully expected tariffs on Chinese imports. Not at all an easy sell, but somewhat palatable if everyone saw that a Fed rate pivot could be expected to weaken the U.S. dollar, which all emerging markets and BRIC 10 memberships were screaming at the IMF to make happen. The China meeting also became an urgent meeting because of yet another very important factor. Every 4 months or 3 times a year, Yellen must release the expected Treasury offerings that will be available during the next cycle of Treasury auctions. As the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield chart shown here illustrates, every time this document is issued, see the orange bubbles on the left, 3 of them, it instigated a sustained trend direction. Yellen needs the next release, due to be released on May 1st, to initiate a downward trend direction. Yellen needs to take the load off debt interest payments now and ensure the auctions deliver the buyers needed. She can't count on the Fed pivoting quite yet without a serious crisis triggering the Fed's actions, something no one wants in a critical election year. The underappreciated driver for the cap-in-hand urgent trip to China is that inflation is only soon to work against lower rates, and she needs China's help. Over the last 6 weeks, we have seen this happen, which caught the market offside. Rates, as shown here, have shot higher and will keep going if something isn't done, especially when the Fed is reiterating that higher for longer is the required direction. What we haven't talked about yet is where China is in all this. What do they need to leverage Yellen's problems to China's benefit? Unlike the U.S., where nearly 70% of the economy is consumption-driven, China's economy is 43% dependent on capital formation and foreign direct investment, or FDI. It is quite literally in free fall as a result of Xi Jinping's recent shifts towards less friendly treatment of foreign corporations and anti-U.S. business policies. Not only has foreign investment stopped, but profits are being repatriated versus reinvested in China. Separately, China manufacturing unit labor costs per hour have become a major problem against other Asian alternatives. As a result, Xi Jinping and the CCP are facing 22 to 24% youth unemployment because new job growth is not growing fast enough. The youth is more educated than only 2 decades ago as Chinese farmers move from the rice paddies to the cities for work and a higher standard of living. Their children are educated now and want jobs which build on that education. They don't want factory work. The U.S. as a nearly 70% consumption economy and the Eurozone as 55% consumption economy are critical demand drivers of China's manufacturing juggernaut. However, when the Chinese manufacturing juggernaut reaches a point where it actually begins slowing the rate of economic growth of those countries buying its products, something happens. Job growth and wage growth slows in the consuming countries, and with it, consumer demand growth slows as jobs are lost and competition disappears. This is the slow starvation of what I've been referring to in my writings as the golden goose. Has China potentially now reached such a point? Is this at the core root of China's current dilemma? let's examine the possibility more closely. The U.S. and partners, especially the European Union and also Japan, are concerned about China's manufacturing overcapacity. President Joe Biden, as Yellen reiterated, in China, would not allow another, and I quote, China shock. After China's ascension to the World Trade Organization in late 2001, the country flooded the U.S. and others with goods. The shock then resulted in the loss of 2 million American factory jobs. China is now simply too large, in Biden administration's assessment, for the rest of the world to absorb this enormous capacity. Yellen recently said this, and he also said that actions taken by the PRC today can shift world prices, and when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products, the viability of American and other firms is put in question. First, it is important to understand the reality that China is supply-driven, while the U.S. is demand-driven. There was no shortage for China's cheaper products, and as such, it is about increasing and broadening production and thereby supply. This reflects itself in the fact, as I've already mentioned, that Chinese economic growth is 43% gross capital formation built on foreign direct investment. The U.S., on the other hand, has become a country built on demand or consumption. At nearly 70%, this is the primary driver of the U.S. economy. The U.S. is a country where high wages and easy, affordable finance allows this consumption. Supply equals production versus demand equals consumption. The ever-expanding U.S. trade deficit means the U.S. consumes more than it produces. This difference must be financed. Until recently, this hasn't really been a problem. But with staggering debt to GDP of 130%, the financing of the debt is shrinking the available domestic capital stock, making it more dependent on foreign investment. Production equals investment capital. Consumption equals financing, jobs and workers, and immigration. The U.S. needs foreign investment to allow financing of consumption, that is demand, while China needs foreign investment to finance production, that is supply. It is all unbalanced due to China's overproduction or overcapacity. China's overcapacity is not the product of a mistake. It is the inevitable result of the Communist Party's economic system. There is a shortage of domestic demand due to Beijing's policies designed to depress consumption, or at least maintain it. Therefore, the country exports its excess industrial supply. Chinese goods depress prices in foreign markets, which results in foreign businesses failing. China creates overcapacity because giving money to bureaucrats and state-owned companies is what the system knows how to do. And Stevenson Yang of J Capital Research in the U.S. said this week, and I quote, "Building new factories makes it look like China is growing, even when demand is actually falling," end of quote. Both China and the U.S. have enabled each other since China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. China adopted the proven export mercantile strategy that Japan did. China took its rapidly expanding currency reserves and bought U.S. Treasury bonds to hold those reserves in. This made consumer financing rate in the U.S. smaller, taking yields down, while also strengthening the dollar, making Chinese goods cheaper for Americans to buy. The strategy worked as it initially did for Japan. As this chart shows, however, China's supply has taken on such a commanding position in the world, the manufacturer to the world actually, that it is now steadily stripping jobs from the export countries. The buyers of Chinese products are seeing their consumption being weakened as jobs and economic growth comes under pressure. The Chinese strategy is still to increase production, and therefore it needs to go upscale or increase the production of higher value-added products. Until recently, this has been the protected domain of the developed countries that allow the high-paying jobs and consumption. Xi Jinping is very clear that is where they are going and will not be deterred. Xi Jinping is reluctant to reverse policies that depress consumption because that would offend key constituents in the Communist Party as well as undermine the solvency of the banks which underpin the Chinese economic system. Moreover, Xi does not want to empower consumers. Finally, he is intent on putting China on a wartime footing, which means it's determined to build even more industrial capacity. In Xi Jinping's last trip to the U.S., he met with U.S. business executives in San Francisco to reassure them about investing in China. Whatever he said was met with 3 standing ovations of approval. Xi Jinping just finished at another meeting in Beijing with other global business leaders. He will not be deterred. As would be expected, the business leader will ride whatever horse will deliver profits and growth with assurances they can operate effectively, knowing their investments will be secure. That is what they're looking for. Time will tell whether Z can be trusted or whether he is the better bet than whoever runs the next U.S. administration. The U.S. strategy, therefore, has increasingly become one of heading towards tariffs, protective regulations, de-risking, and onshoring. De-risking and onshoring has a lot of merit, but unfortunately the U.S. has gutted its manufacturing prowess over the last 2 decades. It will take a decade to retrain the skills that were once so prevalent in the industrial giant the U.S. was as late as the 1990s. Frankly, the strategy of both is highly likely to only result in the mutual killing of the golden goose of global economic prosperity. It is almost assured we are on a collision course which is doomed to only result in heightened global conflict. The current strategic thinking of both will no doubt go through more than a few morphing adjustments. The real issue is, what is Yellen going to do within the financial funding reality she now today faces? We've watched Yellen closely for a few years now, and one thing we are certain of is that she is a master manipulator and can be counted on to come up with a devious way to achieve whatever she needs. It is our studied opinion now that Yellen has a trump card she is about to play. Remember, we got out of the 2008 financial crisis as a nation by altering behind the scenes the accounting of bank derivative holdings. We removed the requirements for mark-to-market for derivatives and went to what has become laughably referred to as mark-to-magic. These changes, by the way, have never been reversed. One thing you can count on with government is that when the going gets tough, they cheat or change the rules. They're one of the few entities that can get away with such a proven and given approach. Yellen must maintain the continued funding growth for the U.S. Treasury debt. The latest game of trickery, we believe, is going to be about the Treasury holdings from the SLR, that is, stands for the Supplementary Liquidity Ratio calculation, which is used to determine how much banks need to set aside to help manage risk. Though we supposedly have a strong economy, the Treasury is selling bonds at a rate last seen during the COVID crisis. The new SLR rule change could allow and will allow banks to be endless buyers of Treasury debt. How convenient for the banks to be able to buy Treasuries, take no haircut, and not have to worry about mark-to-market losses, all just in time as issuances are taking on a life of their own. The great taking, which we've talked about in our annual thesis paper, the regulatory state, revealed that the bond market is also fractionalized, not enough to go around, and some bonds held on the books by more than one owner, what is called rehypothecation. It is increasingly sounding like a risky proposition to keep calling our government bonds pristine collateral or risk-free or safe haven assets. Maybe we should call them what they are, not bonds, but rather bombs. So what can we conclude? Everything we've discussed leads to one conclusion. We are heading towards an era of currency wars or trade wars. We saw this when Britain relinquished global leadership to the U.S. in the 30s. When global finance becomes a problem, the first weapon of choice of governments is their currency. Whether to gain competitive export price advantage or control competitive total bond yields or to export inflation, currencies are always the name of the game. The U.S. dollar is currently extremely overvalued and ripe for the attack. The BRIC 10 and global commodity oil producers are well aware of this. The U.S. no longer has the petrodollar, the yen carry trade, riskless treasury bonds, nor unquestioned reserve currency status to hide behind, which we did in the 1970 era of inflation. Additionally, the U.S. has chronic problem of producing less than it consumes, which makes it unfit for the currency battles ahead without some profound changes. Cheating never solves real problems for long. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and the central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems, until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by 1. Policies of fiat currencies, 2. Unsound money, 3. Political polarization, and 4. Global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.